So, thank you for that introduction. And today's discussion topic is about bringing extraordinary people together. And we're discussing this in the context of the big collaboration between the FCDO of UK on the one hand and TiE Delhi NCR and Startup India on the other hand to create what is possibly going to be one of the biggest mentoring platforms. Now, Matt, you run Entrepreneur First, or EF as it's popularly known, which describes itself as the world's leading talent investor. And you're doing this across the world, you're doing this at scale. The locations, many locations that you have include London and Bangalore, and in between that, you have Berlin, Paris, Toronto, Singapore as well. Now, and when I said you've done this at scale, you've had, I believe, about over 2,000 founders who form part of this community, over 200 seed funded startups who've together gone ahead and raised $1 billion in terms of capital. Now, very clearly, the focus of ES is fascinating for us today because so closely linked to the topic that we've picked about how extraordinary people coming together can make so much of a difference. So I'd like to start by asking you, you've probably been the most avid talent watcher I've ever met. You've met talent across the world, invested in them, and therefore I'm reasonably sure that by now you have a playbook or a framework or a magical formula or a secret formula which says, look, here's where I should place my bets. This founder is likely to succeed. So, can you share with us what that formula or playbook looks like and how good is your framework at predicting that this founder is likely to be that extraordinary founder who's going to build a great business?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me first. It's a real pleasure to be here. And you're absolutely right that I've spent most of the last decade thinking about what does entrepreneurial talent look like. So I have a couple of thoughts on this. One of which that I'll kick off with is maybe a little bit controversial, which is that I don't think it's actually possible to know whether someone will be a good founder before they start. Now that might sound strange coming from someone whose entire business is built on trying to select great founders before they start, but let me explain what I mean by that. I think we get a little bit obsessed sometimes with the idea that there is a sort of guide that if you're just like the guidebook, you will succeed. Actually, I think one of the most exciting things about entrepreneurship is just how diverse successful entrepreneurs are. They have a small number of things in common, which I'll come to. But I suppose one of the things I most want entrepreneurs to hear is you don't have to look like any previous successful founder. Your background doesn't need to be the same for you to have a shot. In fact, one of the things I often say to people, and this is the whole philosophy of EF, is that only by starting can you discover whether you've got what it takes. There is no test you can take that will tell you whether you have the characteristics that you need. There's no interview. Even the EF interview, which I think is pretty good, will tell you whether you will succeed. You can almost imagine that your abilities as a founder are discovered by the act of starting rather than something that can be analytically determined beforehand. And I think this is really important because one of my core beliefs, the reason I started this business with my co-founder Alice, over a decade ago, is I believe the world's missing out on some of its best founders. I believe there are literally tens of thousands of people out there who could be wildly successful entrepreneurs who never get started. So actually, I think one of the most important things is to tell those people, you should try. And our job, both at EF, but I think in the startup ecosystem more broadly, should be less to try and raise barriers and say who's good enough to get over the hurdle, and more saying how do we lower the cost of getting started so that more people could discover whether they have what it takes. That said, I think there are some things that are pretty useful foundation for great entrepreneurs, but I think they're quite basic. So one of the myths that I like to dispel is I think some people believe, certainly used to be very popular to argue, that some people are just born entrepreneurs. Like, it was what they were meant to do. Almost like there's a gene for entrepreneurship that, if you got it, you'll be fine. If you don't, there's no point trying. I actually think the things that we found, when I look at the nearly $8 billion worth of companies we've created and who created them, what we found is the things that predicted success in starting up a company are very similar to the things that would predict success in many other walks of life. We look for people who are obviously very smart. Entrepreneurship is applied problem solving. It would be very hard to be a good entrepreneur if you couldn't solve problems on the fly, and often very complicated ones. Entrepreneurs also need to be extremely determined. You're going to face setbacks along the way, and giving up is the single biggest cause of failure. So like having that resilient personality so you don't just give up, super important. You need to have that drive to achieve. Ambition is a super important resource for entrepreneurs, partly because it's one of the things that keeps you going when things are hard, but also if you think about startups as a discovery journey, you do need to be trying to do something big in order to discover the way. If you set your sights too small, you're going to basically go around in circles a lot of the time. And finally, I think you do need some desire to change things, some desire to not just accept the status quo as it's given. Now, you might say, well, those four things sound like a playbook. I guess what I would say is, if you're imagining a big company hiring people for a high-paid job that is going to have a lot of impact, they'd probably actually say very similar things. I see that as a good thing. What that suggests to me is there are many more people out there who could be great founders than are trying now. So I'll stop talking, but I suppose what we've learned at EF is to be humble. We want to make entrepreneurship accessible. Yes, we want a high bar across those four basic character traits, but the most important thing we want is to actually observe what someone does once they're given the chance to get started. That's what we think is the key.
Well, actually, that's a fantastic premise. The point that literally anyone can be an entrepreneur. There are so many undiscovered ones out there. As long as you're smart, resilient, ambitious, and want to change the status quo, you should give it a shot. And only when you give it a shot, you really know whether you're going to be a successful one or not. It's so inclusive, it's so massive that it can actually inspire literally tens of thousands of people. And that's what makes what you said so interesting, actually. But if I take the analogy of you literally picking up diamonds, uncut, semi-finished, in some cases more finished, and because the diamonds are of all kind, in some cases you probably go and dig them out of the ground. How do you kind of go looking for these diamonds, whether they're unfinished or whether they're semi-finished? Unlike most VCs who rely on an inbound deal flow or occasionally go to events where they meet startups, looks like you need to cast your net really, really wide. And therefore, how do you do that actually?
Yeah, I mean, that's where a huge part of the resource of Entrepreneur First as a company is dedicated. Because you're right, it's not like being a venture capitalist where there's a somewhat fixed universe of companies, and your job is to make sure that they know about you and that you meet them. So we sort of think of this problem in sort of three ways. First is we need to be well known to people who are looking to solve the problem of getting started. So there is at any one time a group of people out there saying, maybe I should start a company, or I'm going to start a company one day. Why not now? So, we have just a cool marketing job of making sure we're known to those people. And we do that by working closely within startup ecosystems, with venture capital funds, with startup community groups, often with student groups. One of the reasons that I was really delighted to do this event was because we want to talk about what we do to the what we would call the active community of future entrepreneurs, people who actively are thinking about this plan. So a big part of our job is just to build our brand and be known out there. Two different ways we think about that may be a little bit different. One is we're actually we often joke at EF, we're in the customer service business. It's just that our customers are entrepreneurs. Actually, one of the most important sources of great talent is the friends, contacts, teammates of our entrepreneurs. So referrals from our community are super important. And one of the reasons that we invest really heavily in our community is partly to help. We think it's one of the ways to make our founders succeed once they've started. Having advice from peers, super important. But also we know that the unicorn founders of the future are very likely to be the employees of earlier successful companies. And so referrals from our alumni community and the broader community, our second sort of big way of finding talent, really important to us. And actually, although we have an open application form and as I've already described, we have a pretty clear sense of what we're looking for, and we try to be very inclusive. It's certainly true that we love referrals. If someone from within our community is like, you should really take a look at this candidate, they're fantastic, that we weigh that very heavily. That's important to us. Right. The third, and I think it also fits with this sort of theme of inclusion, is we think many of the best future founders don't know it. They don't know that that's necessarily in their path. Now, I think that maybe isn't true in Silicon Valley. I kind of feel if you've lived and worked in Silicon Valley for a few years and you've never thought about starting a company, maybe it's just not for you. I mean, you're surrounded all the time by people who their sole thing is building or funding or working at startups. But in a lot of the world, now it's certainly count the UK in this, and I think for a lot of people in India too, starting a company is not necessarily on the radar. It's certainly not yet at the stage that it might be in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, where it's the one thing on everyone's mind. There are lots of career paths that your parents, would love to see you do, your teachers, your professors, your friends are saying is that, like the top career path. And so one of our theses at EF is that if we don't proactively reach out to that group, what I would call less active within the entrepreneurial community, we're going to miss out on great founders. And so quite a big part of what we do is proactively reach out to people who we think have those characteristics we described, but maybe aren't yet within a network or community that is encouraging entrepreneurship. Right. Maybe they're working in a big corporate. Maybe they're working in finance. Maybe they're doing something completely different. We've had people join EF having been professional dentists and deciding it's not for them. We've had people join us out of the military. We've had doctors join us. We've had all sorts of different backgrounds. And so a big part of how we reach them is by proactive outreach and, right. Really trawling the internet, trawling offline communities to find people who we think maybe have what it takes.
Right. No, I think that's interesting because when you build your brand, you'll obviously get an inbound request. But reaching out proactively to the ones who are passive and not really entrepreneurship is not on their radar requires effort. And you'd be glad to know that this video will this session will be seen by close to 10,000 people. And therefore, many of them would be those passive fence sitters or people who are not thinking about it. And therefore, that would be great. And referrals, of course. But by the way, I must also tell you this, that Shark Tank in India, which has been on for a few months, has created widespread awareness about entrepreneurship. So you should see a momentum on account of that as well. But Matt,
it's a good point, actually, because, one thing that I strongly believe is that probably the single biggest thing we need in emerging ecosystems, by which I really mean everywhere other than Silicon Valley. I know at this stage, India has decacorns, many unicorns, so it's not emerging in that sense. But one thing I feel both about the UK and India is that it's still this case that we haven't yet got enough role models that have really got cut through to the general population. Now, obviously, if you're into startups, you'll know about the founders of Flipkart or Paytm or Swiggy or any of these great companies. But there's not, when you ask the general population to name entrepreneurs, they typically will give you the names of entrepreneurs of, the last generation, people building sort of traditional industrial companies. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's great in its own right. But I think things like Shark Tank are fantastic for creating the cut through to the idea that entrepreneurship has changed. It's very different from the way that the richest people in the UK or India made their fortunes 30, 40 years ago. And so I love stuff like, the sort of popularization of these new narratives around entrepreneurship. I think it's going to be hugely high impact.
Well, that's so true. I know I've obviously had a chance to mentor many of the Indian startups in the cohort. What role do you think your mentors across the world play in terms of helping these startups navigate through all these choppy waters?
So I strongly believe that mentoring is an absolutely crucial ingredient of really any startup journey, but particularly I see this at Entrepreneur First literally every week. So I think there are probably two different ways of thinking about why mentoring is so valuable. The first is if you're a first-time founder, and Entrepreneur First is very focused on first-time founders. The vast majority of people that join us, this is their first company. One way to think about mentoring is just it's the mother of all shortcuts. Do you really want to have to learn by trial and error? the answers to all the most common questions, and indeed how to avoid the most common mistakes? Or do you want someone who's just seen that many times? And I've been very lucky now to see, probably 500 companies at the start of their journeys through to, in some cases, being very large companies. And yes, each has their own unique challenges, but there is this core of call it 25 core challenges that every company goes through. And if you just have someone who's seen those before and can help you avoid the worst pitfalls and navigate, it's just the mother of all shortcuts. Why wouldn't you want that? That would be my first pillar. My second pillar, though, in a way is deeper, which is just that starting a startup is, I would say, psychologically very challenging. I think we often talk about, either the intellectual challenge or, the pure commercial challenge, can you find something that people want? I think we don't talk enough about the, what it feels like to be a founder, the sort of lived experience, if you like, of being in an environment. I'm not talking about EF here. I just mean the act of trying to build something from nothing, where the default is to fail. Most startups fail. And I think everyone should be super transparent about that. Most startups fail and most customers say no. Most investors say no. The life of a founder, at least to begin with, is one of constant rejection. Right. And most of the people that we work with, many of them, come from backgrounds or careers where they're not used to that. Failure is not the default. Most of the time they're being praised, not rejected. And so one of the things that I think, and it sounds simple, but it's incredibly valuable that a mentor can provide, is just someone who can say with credibility, this is normal. The way you're feeling is normal. You're not a freak. You're not a weirdo. You're not handling it worse than other people. This is normal. And I think sometimes just hearing that, yes, it is hard, but people get through it. And, this is how, is one of the most valuable things that a founder can have. And that's why we've put mentoring through what we call the venture partner model at EF at the heart of everything we do.
I love what you said, the mother of all shortcuts. I think that's a great phrase I'm going to borrow and steal from you, Matt.
Right.
But apart from that, this whole concept of lived experience of being a founder is so true, because that empathy that it brings to the table is so important. But I'm going to ask you a question. There are so many successful founders who all had their share of lived experiences, but not all of them make good mentors. And you've seen mentors through your programs across the world. So what makes a good mentor different from someone who's not so good, and across all the patterns that you spotted? And one trick question on top of that, how do you see the mentors in India versus mentors elsewhere, talent in India versus talent elsewhere? That's a trick question, because I'm a party of interest here, as you know. The first one first. What makes a good mentor a good mentor?
So I think there is a baseline level of knowledge, no doubt, just having either through founding or investing, just having seen enough that you have some answers to the most common questions. But I actually think the difference between the best mentors and the merely good mentors is not about knowledge, and it's not about the level of success that mentor has enjoyed in their own, in their own companies or in their own investing. I think the two things that make exceptional mentors stand out from less exceptional ones are empathy and humility. And at that, I realize could sound like an easy answer, oh, isn't that nice and warm and fluffy? But let me try and paint a picture of why I genuinely think that's so important. So the first is that usually when a founder asks the question, the answer itself is not the most helpful response for them to get. Most of the time, the reality is these days, founders can Google a lot of questions. That didn't used to be the case. Yeah. But now the answers to many important questions are commoditized online. What cannot be commoditized online is someone that actually understands where you are on your journey and understands the question behind the question. What is the actual challenge that you are going through as a founder and that your company is experiencing? It's very tempting, particularly for people who have been successful, to jump to the answer. Oh, you're wondering about pricing strategy. Cool. Let me tell you what I did. Maybe that's helpful. But maybe it's not. Like, really having the empathy to be like, well, okay, so what's going on here? Like, why is this important? Where does this fit within the context of the company's journey, the founder's journey? Super important. And I think in a way, without empathy, you almost get a sort of like Q&A bot. And like, really, that's not, I think, in 2022 what most founders need. So that would be my first pillar. And so why do I say humility? Basically because I don't think that I think most founders, as I say, don't need to hear what worked for the mentor. Context is so key, right? And every context is different. So the trouble is mentors with low humility will tend to go first to their own experience and describe their own experience and why they succeeded. That's not really the goal. I had a colleague who really helped us build EF, a guy called Alex Crompton, who was one of our first employees. He's now a venture partner at EF. And he likes to talk about different kinds of advice. And he has this framework that he sort of introduced to me, which I think he created himself, that I think about all the time, which is, there's the difference between answer advice, where you have someone gives you a problem and you say, here's the answer, and what he calls like method advice. You could see it as a version of like the difference between giving a man a fish and teaching him how to fish. But one thing Alex talks about a lot is like, look, I don't know what the right answer is for you, but I can tell you how I would think about solving the problem, sort of from first principles. And I think almost like passing on mindsets to a founder, but being aware that the one that made you successful won't necessarily be the one that makes the founder successful. I think that's really important. And without humility, particularly when you're very successful and the startup founders just starting out, it's hard to do. So I think empathy and humility are the core.
I think empathy, humility, and the last point that you made, answer advice versus method advice, is a great distinction. I must tell you this because you also come from a country where cricket is a popular sport, as in India. To make the point clear about great mentor and not so great mentor, I point towards two of the foreign cricket coaches that the Indian cricket team has had. Gary Kirsten, immensely successful. He had empathy and humility. India won the one-day ODI World Cup under him. Greg Chappell from Australia, terrible, because his approach was my way or the highway, never worked actually. And that, because people understand cricket, they kind of relate to this one, but I'm glad you believe the same way. On that topic, I have a question. As you know that the two parties that are working together, the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO of UK government, and Startup India from India and Delhi-NCR are putting together a massive mentoring program to support 100,000 aspiring and early stage entrepreneurs. Now, as they set out to build this mentoring platform and create a large base of mentors, any words of advice you would give based on your own lived experiences of doing this across the world?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things, if I were going to try and build a mentoring platform from scratch, I think one of the things I would look for is, it's very tempting to think, how do I get the most sort of famous, celebrated, successful mentors? And if I do that, it will attract the founders and it will work. Now, there's some truth to that, right? You need some, in any sort of matching program, you need to solve the chicken and egg problem of, how do you attract each side? But I'd be very wary of the impulse that the best mentors necessarily are the ones with the biggest brands. Sometimes they are. And, I've been very lucky in my life to have some mentors who are really celebrated and famous. People like Reid Hoffman, he has been a fantastic mentor. But I also have mentors who've been as or more impactful that no one has ever heard of. And I suppose what it leads me to think is probably the most important thing on the mentor side is to really understand what are the motivations of the mentors for getting into this. I think a danger is attracting mentors who mainly, whether they're aware of it or not, they want to do it for the ego boost of being in the position of giving advice. Yeah. And that's pretty dangerous. It cuts against empathy and humility a lot of the time. And so I think thinking about how to incentivize mentors who really have the right motive around what's best for the founder is really important. One of the weird things, and I think actually one of the things that Silicon Valley is very good at, and one of the reasons it's been successful, is that I think certainly in the UK, certainly when we started EF 10 years ago, it almost felt like a hierarchical relationship between mentor and mentee. The mentor was the successful one, and the mentee is the kind of humble student. One of the interesting things about Silicon Valley is that almost that's reversed. Everyone in Silicon Valley starts from the assumption that the kid in front of them could be the next Mark Zuckerberg. And actually, for the mentor-mentee relationship to be successful, you have to start from the assumption that the mentee has what it takes to be way more successful than you as the mentor. If what is important to you as a mentor is to almost maintain the hierarchy, you're going to become the limit on what the mentee can achieve. It's good for your ego. I have a healthy ego. I'm very I understand the impulse. Good for the ego to want to present, to be the one that knows it all now. But actually, one of the most valuable learning experiences I've had in my entire life is seeing entrepreneurs who joined EF and looked up to me, who I now look up to. They're running companies that are much more valuable than EF, much bigger, will be higher impact. And I think having mentors who are truly prepared for that, who want their mentees to be more successful than them, absolute key to any successful mentoring.
No, so true. Ego can be such a big dampener in this whole relationship. So true. Before I let you go, I want to ask you something else. EF is all about being a talent investor, betting on extraordinary talent. And this program that FCDO and we in India are creating is also about supporting extraordinary talent. It's a great cross-border program. Given that EF is headquartered in UK and this is in India, which is another site for you, is there something that you think EF can do to support or participate in this program? Because it's so closely linked, the two missions, so to say, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would love to explore how we can get involved and collaborate. I mean, I think if you go back to EF's mission, EF exists because we believe that the world's missing out on some of its best founders, and because we want to play a role in changing that. And it feels like our missions here are very aligned with what's going on between FCDO and its partners. So yeah, I would love to see how we could do that. I think there are lots of ways I can imagine helping on both sides. I think both on the talent side of how do we source great founders and cross-pollinate, but also on the mentoring side. And I think it's something certainly that I can imagine our broader team of venture partners in India and beyond would love to get involved in, because as I say, I think the missions are just so compatible.
And who knows, you may find many of your diamonds out here, uncut, semi-polished, semi-finished,
Absolutely.
and the next big Mark Zuckerbergs across the world, actually.
Absolutely.
So, pleasure having you with us today, Matt. This has been a great conversation and so closely aligned to what we're setting out to do here. Thank you once again for being here. Have a good day.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Bye.